Think about how fast science can move when it really has to. The COVID-19 vaccine.
Yeah.
From the moment researchers at the NIH started their work to Pfizer and Moderna announcing their trial results, it was about 10 months.
Just 10 months. It was an incredible acceleration, really.
A lightning-fast development that held the promise of saving millions. A game changer.
It really highlighted what's possible, with focused scientific effort. And that global collaboration piece was huge, too.
Definitely. Shows how quickly knowledge can turn into, well, actual solutions in a crisis.
Exactly.
And for this deep dive, we've got two sources that look at public health and scientific endeavors, particularly through the lens of one central figure. We'll be exploring insights from On Call, a doctor's journey in public service.
Right, that gives us a really detailed firsthand account of these experiences.
It does. But to provide a fuller picture, we also have The Real Anthony Fauci Book Tour, a true crime journey.
And that one offers a very different perspective, doesn't it? A critical view, alternative interpretations of events, motivations.
Exactly. So our goal here is to understand the key takeaways from both. We want to give you a well-rounded view without us taking sides.
Just laying out what the sources say.
Right. Our mission is basically to distill the most crucial information from these sources, make it concise, engaging, a shortcut maybe to understanding the big moments and these, well, contrasting narratives around vaccine development and public health leadership.
Okay, so where do we start?
Let's kick things off at the beginning, looking at the early influences on the individual at the heart of this, Dr. Anthony Fauci, based on the details in On Call. Born Christmas Eve, 1940, Brooklyn.
And delivered by an obstetrician, supposedly in a tuxedo.
That's the story. Straight from a party, apparently, under his medical gown. It certainly paints a picture.
It does. But more seriously, what seems really foundational is his family background. His father, the drugstore owner.
Yeah, the source emphasizes strong ethics, integrity, kindness, hard work, long hours at the store.
A real family affair, it sounds like. His mother and sister helping out, too.
And young Anthony delivering prescriptions on his bike. That early exposure to service, maybe.
Seems likely. That and the dedication. And there's even a mention of the day he became Tony instead of Anthony. Small details, but they add color.
They do. Then his education, Regis High School. Sounds intense.
Very rigorous, yeah. Classics, Latin, Greek, French, but also strong on science. And the Jesuit influence.
Men for others. That ethos seems pretty significant looking back. Discipline, service.
Absolutely. You can see how that might guide career choices later on. He was athletic too, right?
He was.
Yeah.
High-scoring point guard, captain of the basketball team.
Shows leadership, competitive drive. He knew he wouldn't go Division I,
But he channeled that energy, apparently inherited speed from his dad, who was a city track champion.
Interesting connection. So that drive, that focus probably carried over.
Seems so. He graduates #1 at Cornell Medical School. That's quite something.
Top of his class.
Yeah.
And then he chooses to focus on infectious diseases. Why that field specifically?
Well, the source says it was the potential for tangible impact.
Tangible impact, meaning?
You know, the ability to prevent illnesses with vaccines, treat them with therapies, maybe even cure them.
Ah, right. A direct way to alleviate suffering. Fits with that service idea.
Exactly. And even when he was registered for the draft during Vietnam, he prioritized the U.S. Public Health Service.
Again, showing that commitment. And the NIH interview story is great, too.
The first question, do you like soft-shell crabs?
From Dr. Sheldon Wolf, yeah. Just goes to show, even in these serious settings.
You get those human moments. Then he hits a big career crossroads.
NIAI research position versus chief medical resident at Cornell. Big choice.
So why NIH? What tipped the balance?
According to On Call, it was the potential for broader impact, the multiplier effect.
Meaning research could affect more people than direct patient care alone.
Exactly. Influencing guidelines, practice, reaching a much larger population. A strategic view, really.
So these early experiences really seem to set the stage. Dedication, service, scientific focus.
Which leads us right into a really pivotal period, the AIDS epidemic.
Yeah, let's shift there. On Call describes him picking up that June 5th, 1981 MMWR report, pneumocystis pneumonia in Los Angeles.
And what stood out immediately was how unusual it was, this rare pneumonia.
In young, otherwise healthy men. And they were all homosexual. That was the common thread.
A real puzzle, especially for someone with his immunology background. Initial thoughts might have included things like recreational drug use, amyl nitrite perhaps, but the immune deficiency was the key mystery.
And his response was immediate, wasn't it? He decided to make it his full-time focus.
He did, jumped right in. proactively admitting patients to the NIH Clinical Center to study their immune defects, even before the cause was known.
That says a lot, facing the unknown head on.
Definitely. A drive to investigate to find answers when this huge threat was emerging.
But the early challenges were just immense.
Oh, absolutely. No known cause, no cure. The source describes it feeling like putting Band-Aids on a hemorrhage.
Just awful. And the human cost.
Devastating. Median survival was just 9-10 months after diagnosis back then. Imagine witnessing that, young people suffering and dying and having so little to offer. The emotional toll must have been enormous.
Unimaginable. And then came the realization about the scale of it all, the seroprevalence studies.
Right, finding out that the diagnosed cases were just the tip of the iceberg.
What did those studies reveal?
Really high HIV infection rates in certain groups, sexually active gay men in San Francisco, hemophiliacs in Pennsylvania. And crucially, it showed the long incubation period.
So people could be infected for years before getting sick.
Exactly. The distinction between HIV infection and AIDS became clear. AIDS being defined by that low CD4 plus T cell count and opportunistic infections. That understanding was vital for public health.
And the workload for doctors and researchers during this time.
Just incredible. Treating these complex cases took hours of rounds, constant emergencies day and night.
While also trying to do the immunology research.
Yes, it required huge dedication, incredibly long hours, just relentless pressure.
Yet somehow, life went on personally, too.
Yeah, amidst all that, he met and married Christine Grady and apparently trained for and ran the Marine Corps Marathon.
Wow. That speaks to some serious resilience.
It really does. Professionally, he saw the need for a focused effort.
Creating a separate division of AIDS within IAD.
Right. A crucial move to dedicate resources and expertise. Apparently, there was some internal resistance.
Making those leadership decisions can be tough.
But he pushed it through. Doubled the AIDS budget, too. Shows the priority he placed on it.
And built key relationships, like with Jim Hill at NIAID.
Who became his special assistant later. Having trusted colleagues is so important in those roles.
Definitely. And we have to remember the global picture, too. The disparities were huge.
Just stark. While research was advancing here, patients in Southern Africa often lacked even basic treatments. A whole different reality.
This period also saw the rise of AIDS activism. A lot of frustration.
Understandably so. The gay community felt the government response was too slow, too inadequate.
President Reagan's delay in even mentioning AIDS publicly didn't help.
No. There was this feeling of not enough investment in research prevention. It fueled a lot of anger and led to more confrontational protests, like from ACT-UP.
And Fauci engaged with them directly, didn't he?
He did. Invited activists like Peter Staley to NIH to talk. Even when Staley told him they were planning to storm the NIH, he kept the lines open.
That interaction with Larry Kramer in Montreal is interesting, too. Kramer being very confrontational.
But ultimately, they found some alignment, didn't they? A shared sense of urgency, even if their styles were completely different. Kramer apparently urged him to take outrageous actions.
Navigating the politics must have been tricky as well.
Jim Hill's advice was key there. Be consistent, be honest. Fauci aimed for an apolitical stance, building ties across the aisle, testifying before Ted Kennedy, interacting with Vice President Bush.
Which led to that incredible offer later.
Right. President George H.W. Bush offering him White House Chief of Staff.
And he turned it down.
Politely declined, saying his commitment was to public health at NIH. And Bush's reaction was apparently very positive, very understanding, speaks volumes.
But despite all the efforts, the late 80s, early 90s, things got worse before they got better.
Much worse. AIDS cases and deaths surged. It became the leading cause of death for young men aged 25-44 in the U.S. Just a bleak, devastating period.
Yet, science was making critical advances behind the scenes.
Huge discoveries, like demonstrating that HIV was constantly replicating in lymph tissues, even when people seemed healthy, the work by Pantaleo, Fauci, Hassan.
And independently confirmed by Ho and Shaw, too.
Exactly. It showed the virus was always active, always fighting the immune system. That explained why the body couldn't beat it naturally.
And that understanding really highlighted the challenge for vaccine development.
A massive challenge. If natural infection didn't create good neutralizing antibodies, how could a vaccine? Multiple phase 3 trials failed.
That Thai trial showed some initial hope, but it couldn't be replicated.
Unfortunately not. HIV's ability to constantly replicate and evade the immune system just made it incredibly difficult.
But then finally, a breakthrough on the treatment front.
Yes, the mid-90s. Protease inhibitors developed by pharma companies. FDA approvals for sequinavir, ritonavir, indinavir in 95, 96.
That was the beginning of effective combination therapy.
Highly effective therapy. It led to what people called the Lazarus effect.
Right, people who were incredibly sick started getting dramatically better.
Truly dramatic recoveries. It was happening globally, a complete transformation in the outlook for people with HIV.
An amazing turnaround. But even then, a counter-narrative emerged.
HIV denialism. The false idea pushed by people like Peter Duesberg that HIV didn't cause AIDS. Dangerous misinformation.
So that brings us through the intense early decades of AIDS. We've covered a lot there from On Call.
We have the initial shock, the scientific race, the human cost, the activism, the political navigation, and finally, the treatment breakthroughs.
It sets the stage for other crises, but also for the differing views we need to discuss.
Absolutely. Let's touch on some of those other major events mentioned in On Call. The UN Special Session on HIV/AIDS in 2001.
Right, reflecting a much bigger global commitment by then. Then 9/11 happened.
A profoundly shocking day. He recounts the difficulty getting to ground zero.
And soon after, the anthrax attacks.
Suddenly, bioterrorism was a major White House concern. Smallpox became the big fear.
A tough challenge. Since smallpox was eradicated, vaccine supply was limited.
He worked with D.A. Henderson on a protection plan. It highlights his ability to stay calm under pressure.
Where did that come from?
He credits his medical training, those demanding on-call schedules, dealing with critically ill patients. It honed that ability to remain focused in a crisis.
And his biodefense role grew significantly after that.
Became a major spokesperson, built up a long-term research effort, briefed Congress constantly. He declined offers to lead biodefense full-time, though, staying focused on AI.
Then came a truly massive initiative, PEPFAR.
The President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. A huge undertaking. But there was resistance initially, right, within the Office of Management and Budget.
Yes, pushback against the multi-billion-dollar cost. But advocates like Bono, support from figures like Mitch Daniels, and ultimately President Bush's decision drove it forward.
$15 billion over 5 years. A landmark program.
Absolutely life-changing for millions globally. Around the same time, there were debates about smallpox vaccination.
Vice President Cheney was pushing for broader vaccination, concerned about Iraq.
But Fauci argued against mass vaccination.
Yeah, he favored vaccinating voluntary response teams, not the general public. He felt the risk of a massive attack was lower than the risk of vaccine side effects for everyone. A calculated risk assessment.
This led into Project BioShield as well.
Developing a big biodefense research agenda, needing regulatory flexibility, special funding. More battles with OMB, apparently.
Mentioned in the State of the Union. But the Iraq War seemed to impact its urgency.
It did. And then reports of adverse events from the limited smallpox vaccinations came in, and civilian uptake was low.
He actually went to Iraq in 2003.
Experienced a war zone, firsthand corkscrew landings, mortar attacks, saw the medical care for soldiers and Iraqi civilians.
Then came other pandemic threats. Influenza.
Always a concern. Seasonal flu is predictable, but the dominant strain isn't. Then H5N1 bird flu emerged as a worry in 2004.
Vaccine supply issues with Chiron that year highlighted the system's fragility.
Reliance on eggs for manufacturing. President Bush really pushed for better pre-pandemic vaccine development. Failure is not an option.
And then a real pandemic hit. 2009 H1N1 swine flu.
Emerged unexpectedly near the U.S.-Mexico border. Person-to-person spread, little prior immunity. HHS went into battle mode.
But vaccine delivery was slower than promised.
Yeah, the initial optimism from pharma companies wasn't quite met. The virus grew slowly in eggs, lots of public communication needed.
Moving forward, by 2011, the focus on HIV was reignited.
30th anniversary. Fauci described being obsessed with moving towards an HIV-free world, emphasizing treatment as prevention.
Calling for more global resources in a Science article.
Then, 2014 brought Ebola in West Africa.
Described as a perfect storm, inexperience, mistrust, poor infrastructure, porous borders, urban spread.
WHO was criticized for a delayed response. NIH admitted Ebola patients, including nurse Nina Pham. Fauci even recertified to be directly involved in care.
And the case of Dr. Craig Spencer in NYC sparked huge debate about returning healthcare workers.
Governors pushing for quarantines versus public health advice for monitoring. President Obama had to step in.
Followed quickly by Zika in 2015-16.
Big political fights over funding, had to reallocate Ebola money, public anxiety was high,
And the devastating impact on babies' microcephaly.
hundreds of thousands of cases. The outbreak eventually burned itself out, partly due to a saturation effect before a vaccine was ready.
Which brings us right up to early 2020 and COVID-19, briefing President Trump.
Supporting the proposed travel ban despite acknowledging its imperfections. Lots of White House communication efforts.
WHO declares COVID-19. Focus shifts to cruise ships like the Diamond Princess.
And realizing the limitations of CDC's surveillance methods early on.
Trump's initial reaction after visiting NIH was positive, though some staff felt differently.
Fauci emphasized honesty, humility, realism, and public communication, like treating the public as a patient.
But perceptions shifted, didn't they, when the images from NYC hospitals hit?
That seemed to shake President Trump. Then came the politicization of masks.
Trump refusing to wear one. Fauci seeing the public health message importance of the president doing so. The awkward Pence visit to NIH.
Tensions grew within the White House task force. Jared Kushner's skepticism. Trump's behavior towards Fauci becoming more ambivalent, competitive even.
Negative stories leaked. Threats started.
Receiving that letter with powder, thankfully harmless. Trump kept pushing hydroxychloroquine despite the evidence. An agitated task force meeting.
And then Scott Atlas arrived.
Aligning with the Great Barrington Declaration, that flawed herd immunity idea, gaining huge influence. Trump giving Fauci mixed signals, praise one minute, criticism the next.
The political attacks intensified. Fire Fauci rallies.
Fury from Trump loyalists, especially after Fauci commented on Biden's COVID approach, even though he aimed to be apolitical. Endless congressional hearings.
Senator Rand Paul's repeated accusations about NIH funding, gain-of-function research at Wuhan Institute of Virology.
Fauci issued strong rebuttals. Then 2021 brought booster shots into focus.
Realizing vaccine protection wanes, debates over eligibility. President Biden getting deeply involved in the details.
Concern for global vaccine access remained. Then positive news about Paxlovid from Albert Bourla. FDA authorized boosters for adults, a feeling of having built an arsenal against the virus.
But threats continued. Lifting travel bans on southern Africa, then another credible threat on his life late in 2021.
Early 2022 brought the Omicron wave, a tsunami of cases.
Even if perceived as less severe, it strained hospitals massively. Highlighted the huge difference vaccination of boosters made.
And underscored the disturbingly low U.S. vaccination rates. Then that anti-vaxxer rally, led by Robert F. Kennedy Jr., with direct attacks on Fauci. More conspiracy theories, more threats.
By mid-2022, he was considering stepping down.
Adapting to living with COVID indefinitely, shifting from pandemic to endemic mindset.
But also reflecting on the damage done by political division.
The detrimental impact on accepting public health measures like vaccines, lower uptake in Republican states being a clear example.
An anecdote about his college reunion being the only one masked indoors. Awkward.
He then got COVID himself, had a rebound after Paxlovid, even consulted on President Biden's treatment when he got it.
Finally reflecting on retirement after 54 years. Following his instincts, his passion.
Then an unexpected path from quiet research to leading fights against multiple global health crises. Pride in the HIV impact, serving 7 presidents, gratitude for PEPFAR.
Some personal notes, too, making Timpano, a family trip to Sicily, a retirement celebration with Peter Staley, and acknowledging key supporters.
So that's a pretty comprehensive overview based on On-Call. It paints a picture of a long career navigating science, public health crises, and politics.
It absolutely does. Now, we need to bring in the other perspective. The Real Anthony Fauci book tour, a true crime journey, presents a very different narrative.
Extremely different. It raises significant criticisms and allegations. For instance, it talks about the decade of the vaccine initiative involving the Gates Foundation and WHO.
Framing it as philanthropy capitalism.
Yes, alleging significant influence by Gates over agencies like Gavi and CPI, and even extending to control over the global food supply through GMOs and investments.
And it directs criticism squarely at NIH's funding and focus under Fauci.
Claims of a $6.1 billion taxpayer budget plus $1.6 billion from the military for bioweapons research, even alleging most of his salary came from weapons research.
The core accusation seems to be that the focus shifted away from improving American health, leading to an explosion of chronic diseases, while NIH became controlled by Gates, Fauci, and the Wellcome Trust.
And a major point of contention is vaccine safety testing.
The book alleges that none of the 72 mandated childhood vaccines were properly safety tested against a true placebo in preclinical trials.
It mentions a meeting where this was apparently reiterated to Fauci and Francis Collins, claiming no placebo-controlled studies exist despite litigation.
There's also strong criticism of the emergency use authorizations for COVID-19 vaccines.
Calling them reckless, citing alleged harm based on clinical trial data, like the case of Jennifer Gary's paralysis.
It brings up the historical context. The 1986 Vaccine Act designating vaccines as unavoidably unsafe, the Supreme Court case, and the exemption from standard safety testing linked to the CDC's history as a quasi-military agency.
Underlying this is a deep distrust of pharmaceutical industry influence.
The perception presented is that the main metrics became drug sales and agency funding, with NII essentially becoming an incubator for pharma.
There are also specific, very serious allegations about the early AIDS treatment AZT.
Accusations of terminating studies early, unblinding controls, hiding toxicity data, comparing it to remdesivir later on, and the claim that suppressing repurposed drugs cost lives.
And perhaps the most disturbing allegations involve experiments on children?
Yes, claims of barbaric and illegal experiments on foster children using novel chemotherapy drugs for AIDS without proper legal representation. Also mentions experiments in Africa on children and pregnant mothers,
The book also discusses pandemic simulations like Operation Lockstep.
framing them as planning exercises for using pandemics as a pretext for imposing totalitarian controls, suggesting CIA involvement.
Then there's the focus on Ralph Barrick and gain-of-function research.
Alleging the deliberate creation of pandemic viruses using techniques like seamless ligation to hide tampering and claiming the motive was bioweapons, not vaccines. It consistently questions vaccine efficacy and safety more broadly, too.
Citing the lack of long-term placebo trials and pointing to studies like one on the DTP vaccine in Africa allegedly showing increased all-cause mortality afterward.
Concerns about digital passports are also raised.
Linking them to digital currency systems and potential government control over individual lives, citing Trudeau's actions against the truckers in Canada as an example.
And ultimately, the book places immense responsibility on Fauci himself.
Accusing him of responsibility for hundreds of thousands of deaths during COVID and millions more due to denying effective treatments, even comparing his actions to crimes against humanity.
It also criticizes media figures like Jake Tapper for allegedly biased attacks on the author instead of substantive critique of the book's content after its strong sales.
The Simpson-Wood transcripts regarding thimerosal and vaccines are mentioned as well, alleging attempts to hide findings.
And the ivermectin controversy is highlighted, Fauci stating on Tapper's show there was no evidence for it, allegedly ignoring peer-reviewed studies.
So, as you can hear, a completely different, highly critical interpretation of many of the same events and figures discussed in On Call.
Starkly different. Okay, so we've journeyed through the rapid COVID vaccine development, the deep history of the AIDS epidemic, other public health crises, and now these really contrasting perspectives from our two sources.
It's a lot to take in, from the perspective of dedicated public service and scientific advancement in On Call, to the allegations of conflicts of interest, safety concerns, and potential malfeasance in the book tour source.
Absolutely. And just to reiterate, our aim here wasn't to endorse either viewpoint, but to lay out the core arguments and narratives presented in the material we reviewed.
It really highlights how complex these issues are and how the same events can be interpreted in fundamentally different ways. Critical thinking, considering multiple sources, is crucial.
Definitely. As you, the listener, reflect on all this, think about what stood out most. What factors do you think influence public trust or distrust in science and public health institutions? Did hearing these different accounts raise new questions for you?
It's worth pondering. We see incredibly rapid scientific progress, like with the COVID vaccine.
But alongside that, we see deep divisions, conflicting narratives, and challenges to public trust.
Which leads to a final thought to leave you with. In an age with so much information and so many conflicting stories swirling around, what does it actually mean to be truly well-informed, especially on complex topics like public health and science?
That's a heavy question, but an important one to consider.